Chapter 1. The Perfect Illusion. In that moment, something inside me shattered. The man I'd shared my life with, the one I trusted most, had become someone I couldn't recognize. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but I was frozen, paralyzed by the realization that everything I thought we had was a lie. He stared at me with an icy look, almost daring me to react, as if the betrayal was somehow my fault. I remember turning on my heel and leaving without a word, but inside, I felt like I was collapsing. Each step away from him, away from that life, felt like stepping into an abyss. How could I keep going when the ground I thought was solid had crumbled beneath me? In the days that followed, I tried to pretend. I held myself together in front of friends and family, repeating the same lies he'd fed me for months about his late nights and endless work trips. But every time I looked in the mirror, I saw a stranger staring back, someone who was hurt, betrayed, but also awakening. That was when I made my decision. I'd given him my heart, my loyalty, and my time, and he'd thrown it all away. If he thought he could break me and walk away unscathed, he was wrong. Quietly, I began planning, collecting every piece of evidence, every detail I'd need to dismantle his life as carefully as he'd shattered mine. And with each secret uncovered, each small victory, I could feel myself coming back to life. Author's commentary. The first chapter sets the stage for the betrayal. It hooks the reader with an immediate question. How will she respond to such a profound, life-shattering betrayal? We sympathize with her confusion and pain and wonder. How far will she go for justice, and at what cost? Chapter 2. The Breaking Point. From that moment on, I became a quiet observer in my own life, watching his every move while he remained blissfully unaware. Every lie he told, every hasty excuse, every text he tried to hide, it all became ammunition. I recorded details he thought I was too hurt to notice. The nights he slipped in late, the mysterious charges on our bank statements, the sudden bursts of charm before he disappeared for the weekend. I knew his habits down to the smallest detail, and I used that knowledge to plan. During the day, I was the same quiet, composed woman he assumed would keep tolerating his lies. But at night, I worked methodically. I combed through his emails and tracked his spending. I built a case so thorough he wouldn't have a chance to wriggle free. I started showing up at his work events, chatting with his colleagues, and connecting with people in his world. He never suspected that I was laying the foundation for his downfall. The first crack came when I quietly tipped off someone in his company about his extra expenses that didn't add up. I watched from a distance as whispers turned into office gossip, tarnishing his reputation bit by bit. Meanwhile, I made sure I had every right, every document, to protect myself when the inevitable divorce would come. And it would come, I was making sure of it. But my plan didn't stop at destroying his career. I wanted him to feel alone, to taste the bitterness he'd served me. So I reached out to her, the woman he thought he'd hidden so well. She was shocked to hear from me, and even more stunned to learn he was still very much married. In a strange twist, we found common ground in our shared betrayal. We laughed at how foolish we'd both been and, eventually, even became friends. By the time I served him the divorce papers, I had everything lined up. His career in tatters, his mistress gone, his finances under scrutiny. When he finally realized how far I'd gone, he was furious, demanding to know how I'd managed it all without him noticing. I only smiled, watching his face as he pieced it together, as he saw the years of lies unraveling in front of him. For the first time, I felt in control, and as he walked out, empty-handed and defeated, I knew that every tear, every sleepless night, had been worth it. Author's commentary. Here, the main character reaches her breaking point and begins her transformation from a trusting, loving wife to a woman ready to reclaim control. We can see her quiet rage simmering, and we wonder, will her plan for revenge satisfy her need for justice, or will it consume her? Chapter 3. The Masked Wife. Every day, I played my role perfectly. I laughed at his jokes, asked about his day, and kept our home exactly as he liked it. To him, I was the obedient, silent wife, someone who'd never dare disrupt his life. He had no idea what was really happening. I attended every corporate gathering, making polite small talk, strategically befriending his closest colleagues. I made myself seem like an asset to him, like the supportive partner everyone saw on the surface, while secretly peeling back the layers of his deception. Behind closed doors, I became a detective. I tracked every strange expense, those working dinners at restaurants I'd never been to, the luxury hotels where he claimed to stay alone. I took screenshots, gathered receipts, and created a careful log of every suspicious transaction. His careless spending became my greatest advantage. He hadn't even realized I'd quietly taken control of our finances, slowly siphoning funds to secure my own independence. Then, I set my traps. Subtly, I let slip small concerns to his colleagues, innocently asking if his frequent absences were normal or if his workload had increased. Word spread faster than I could have imagined. I could tell by the way they looked at him, the whispered conversations that quieted when he walked into the room, that seeds of doubt had taken root. One evening, I saw my opportunity. I'd overheard him bragging on the phone about a confidential company deal, information he should have kept to himself. I made sure to let the right people know, with just enough detail to set off an internal investigation. Before long, those innocent office rumors grew into real consequences. Still, I kept my mask firmly in place. To his face, I played the part, but inside, I was relentless. He had no idea that the people closest to him, his friends, his colleagues, were beginning to see him as a liability. He was alone, and he didn't even know it. By the time he finally noticed that things were slipping, it was too late. I had him cornered, surrounded by walls he'd never even seen me building. I watched him stumble, his confidence shaken, and for the first time in years, I felt powerful. Author's commentary. This chapter shows her adaptability. She becomes an actress, a master of deception in her own right. Her patience and careful planning reveal the depths of her hurt and her resilience. We're drawn to her cleverness and wonder if her husband will ever catch on. Chapter 4. The beginning of his downfall. At that event, I played my part to perfection. I mingled, smiled, and spoke highly of him when needed. I made sure to appear supportive, even proud, to be by his side. Yet, I carefully chose my words, planting seeds of doubt in the right ears. I'd laugh softly, maybe roll my eyes ever so slightly, before mentioning how he'd been working so many late nights lately, or how his business trips had been taking him away for longer and longer. Each detail sounded like harmless conversation, but I knew the people I was speaking to would notice, would remember. I watched his colleagues exchange glances as they absorbed my innocent comments. It was a mix of curiosity and skepticism, the kind of look that grows into questions later. I could see them wondering, is he really as focused as he claims? I made sure to be subtle, too obvious, and it would have seemed suspicious, but just enough that they couldn't resist speculating. Over the next few weeks, the cracks in his reputation started to show. He had no idea, but every glance he received at the office, every awkward silence in meetings, was because of the quiet whispers I'd started. Suddenly, the little quirks he used to brush off as work habits were being scrutinized. He even came home one night in a sour mood, muttering about gossip in the office. I played the concerned wife, nodding and asking if he needed support, but inside, I was smiling. Then came the next phase. I knew some people in his circle who valued integrity above all else, and it wasn't hard to nudge them to question some of his decisions. I'd learned about an important project he'd been handling, a project with finances he may have cut corners on, rushing to make himself look efficient. I mentioned it to one person who, I knew, would dig deeper. The subtle pressure I'd applied behind the scenes started to show in his frustration. I could see him unraveling, bit by bit, each little slip-up magnified under the spotlight I'd so carefully aimed. He was bewildered, scrambling to understand where things were going wrong, why his superiors had suddenly grown skeptical, why his once stellar reputation had turned shaky. By then, he had no idea that he was the only one in the dark, that every polite smile, every friendly interaction was tainted with suspicion. I watched him struggling to keep up appearances, and for the first time, I felt like I had the upper hand. The world he'd built, the lies he'd layered so carefully, were beginning to collapse, one calculated rumor at a time. Author's commentary. This chapter reveals her strategic mind and the small, careful steps she takes to destabilize him. It's not immediate or reckless, but deliberate. We're captivated by her intelligence and wonder. How long will it take for the cracks to show? Chapter 5. Building Evidence. Every night, after he'd gone to bed, I would slip out of our room and sit by the faint light of my desk lamp, sorting through the trail of clues he'd left behind. It was as if he thought he was invincible, that his lies would never catch up with him. But each document, each suspicious receipt, only fueled my determination. I compiled bank statements showing money disappearing to places he'd never mentioned, phone bills littered with calls and texts at odd hours, even hotel receipts that bore his signature. I could see his double life in plain, damning detail, and it only made me more focused. I'd sacrificed so much for him. I had put aside parts of myself to support his ambitions, his dreams. And now, as I quietly unraveled his secrets, I felt something new inside me, a strength I didn't know I had. I wasn't just taking back what he'd stolen from me. I was preparing to leave him with nothing, just as he'd left me emotionally destitute with his betrayal. But I knew that to pull this off, I'd need more than just documentation. So I started planning a few moves ahead, thinking through every step of the divorce that was sure to follow. I reached out to the best lawyer I could find, one who specialized in cases like mine. I gathered every piece of evidence I could, every financial document that showed just how deeply he'd deceived me, every receipt from his nights away. When the time came, I wanted no loopholes, no way for him to dodge the consequences. The hardest part was playing the role of the oblivious wife. When he'd come home late with flimsy excuses, I'd nod, pretending to believe him. I kept the warmth in my voice, the same way he had kept his facade with me. I forced myself to endure his lies a little longer, knowing that every word he spoke would only make my case stronger. On the nights he thought I was asleep, he'd slip away into his office or hunch over his phone, and I'd lie in bed, silent, waiting, letting his actions speak for themselves. Every move he made, every deceitful look, every touch that felt hollow, became part of the case I was building against him. Then, I began the final phase. I subtly started shifting our finances, securing my own funds, rerouting joint accounts so that when the time came, I wouldn't be left scrambling. I poured over our assets, ensuring that I had a clear picture of every investment and every property he'd so smugly assumed would remain his. In doing this, I felt the power slipping back into my hands, and for the first time in months, I felt truly in control. By the time I was ready, I was armed with enough evidence to ensure he'd lose everything. He didn't realize it, but I was already one step ahead. Every smile, every loving touch I returned was just another calculated move, another brick in the wall that would soon close in on him. I'd given him my heart, and he'd torn it to shreds. But now, as I prepared to dismantle the life he thought was untouchable, I felt the stirrings of freedom. Soon, he'd know exactly what it felt like to lose everything. Author's commentary. The story intensifies as she meticulously collects evidence. Her revenge is as methodical as it is personal. The reader sympathizes with her heartbreak and roots for her, eager to see how she'll use this arsenal against him. Chapter 6. The Mistress and Me. Meeting her was surreal. I had pictured this woman 100 different ways. The temptress, the seductress, the woman who had lured him away. But sitting across from her, I saw none of that. She was younger, yes, and beautiful in that effortless way that almost stung. But she looked just as wounded, just as blindsided as I'd been. She had no idea he was married, no idea of the lies he had told. For her, it was a love story, something real and promising. And now she was learning that it was all built on deception. We met in a small cafe, neutral ground. I could see the shock in her eyes as I introduced myself, as I told her who I was and why I was there. She almost laughed at first, as if it had to be some cruel joke. But then I showed her the proof, photos, receipts, messages. I saw her expression shift from disbelief to heartbreak, the kind that's so raw it makes you numb. And then something surprising happened. Instead of us resenting each other, we found ourselves talking, sharing the stories of his lies, comparing the business trips and late nights he had split between us. We laughed bitterly at the same cheap tactics he'd used on us both, the same empty words. It felt oddly liberating, like finally shedding the weight of our own shame and realizing we were just two people who'd been deeply wronged. By the end of the conversation, she reached across the table, and I could see her own fire burning. She had been hurt too, humiliated, and now she wanted to see him face the consequences. United in our shared betrayal, we began to plan. She had insights into his recent activities, things he had kept from me, and with our combined knowledge, we had a clear map of his double life. But our friendship didn't just end with plotting. She became a surprising source of strength for me. Having someone who understood exactly what I'd been through, who knew the humiliation, the rage, and the numbness, there was a strange comfort in that. We checked in with each other, shared little victories as we uncovered more pieces of his life, small triumphs in our journey of reclaiming our self-respect. I no longer felt like a lone victim of his betrayal. Together, we were a force he hadn't anticipated, women he'd underestimated and thought he could manipulate without consequence. He believed he could keep us both in the dark forever, using our trust to bolster his own lies. But now, as I watched her determined expression over the rim of her coffee cup, I knew that he had made a fatal mistake. He hadn't broken us. He had only ignited something powerful, an alliance that would soon bring his carefully constructed world crashing down. Author's commentary. This chapter shifts the dynamic. By befriending her husband's mistress, she gains a new ally. The irony is delicious, and it's a testament to her growth as she turns pain into camaraderie. We admire her strength and see her as a force he underestimated. Chapter 7. The Divorce Papers. The day I handed him those divorce papers felt like a triumph, a moment I had carefully constructed for months. I was ready, stronger than I'd ever been, with every detail prepared and every loose end accounted for. He looked at the papers in stunned disbelief, his mouth opening, and charm was anything more than a mask. He had to sit with himself, to confront the man he'd become, stripped of the facade he'd worked so hard to maintain. I'm sure he replayed those choices in his mind, wondering how he'd let it come to this. Perhaps he even felt a pang of regret, some small flicker of realization of what he'd destroyed. But by then, it was far too late. He'd burned every bridge, betrayed every trust, and now, he'd have to live with the consequences. As for me, I felt a strange calm. It wasn't joy, exactly, and it wasn't quite relief. It was the quiet satisfaction of knowing that I had reclaimed my life, that I'd broken free from the chains of his lies and manipulation. I was no longer the broken, uncertain woman he'd once known. I had risen above his betrayal, built a new life, and in doing so, I'd left him behind, trapped in the prison of his own choices. I moved forward with my life, and each day, I felt lighter. I found happiness in small things, in simple routines and genuine connections, free from the shadow of his betrayal. I knew he would live with regret, replaying our memories with the sting of knowing he'd lost something real, something that could never be replaced. But as for me, I was free, finally and completely free. And that freedom, that hard-won peace, was the greatest revenge of all. Author's commentary. The depth of his fall becomes apparent, and the reader sees the beauty of karma at work. Her strength and resilience have not only freed her, but have left him to face the consequences of his own deceit. Chapter 9. The Void Left Behind. In the quiet weeks that followed, I drifted through my days like a ghost in my own life. I'd succeeded in everything I'd set out to do. I'd taken my life back, rid myself of his lies, even made a surprising friend in the woman he tried to replace me with. Yet, the satisfaction I had anticipated was strangely absent. I thought victory would feel empowering, like a triumphant release. But instead, my life was hollow, the silence in my home stretching like a vast, empty void. I was free from him, yes, but I hadn't yet reclaimed myself. Each morning, I went through the motions. I'd make coffee, staring out the kitchen window at a world that somehow felt both familiar and foreign. Without him to fight against, without the plan that had consumed me, I felt purposeless. I realized how much of my identity had been wrapped up in him, first as his wife, then as the woman seeking revenge. Now, who was I? Without the goal of tearing down the life we'd built together, I felt aimless, adrift in a sea of possibilities that I wasn't ready to explore. One afternoon, I found myself standing in front of the mirror, really looking at the woman staring back. She looked older, wearier, as if the weight of the past few months had carved lines into her face that hadn't been there before. But as I looked closer, I saw something else too, a glimmer of resilience. I had survived. I had made it through the storm, and I was still standing. I decided to start small. I began with simple acts of care, as if I were tending to a broken thing, coaxing myself back to life. I read books that had been gathering dust on my shelves, went on long walks just to feel the fresh air, and reconnected with hobbies I'd abandoned long ago. I bought fresh flowers for the house, filled the spaces he'd left with color and light. Each small act reminded me that I could create beauty and peace, even if the love we'd once had was gone. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, I began to feel a sense of hope. It wasn't loud or bright. It was a quiet, persistent pulse. I realized that healing wouldn't come all at once, that I couldn't simply erase the scars he'd left. But with every day that passed, I felt a little stronger, a little more whole. Gradually, I found myself laughing again, genuinely smiling at the little joys I'd rediscovered. The emptiness he left would always be part of my story, but it no longer defined me. I was starting to rebuild, creating a life that was finally, truly, closing as he processed what was happening. I watched the realization dawn on his face, the dawning horror that he was losing control over something he had taken for granted. Of course, he didn't accept it gracefully. Later that evening, he showed up at my door, his face flushed with anger. He tried every tactic he'd ever used to control me. The condescending tone, the passive-aggressive reminders of our history, even attempting to intimidate me with threats about how difficult he could make things. But those words, which once held so much power over me, had lost their sting. I wasn't the woman he thought he could manipulate anymore. I stood there, calm, letting him rant and rave, watching as his world collapsed in real time. He demanded answers, asked who I'd spoken to, how I'd learned about everything, but I stayed silent. Letting him stew in his confusion was far more satisfying than giving him the closure he wanted. Eventually, he grew tired of the one-sided argument, exhausted by his own frustration. With nothing left to say, he stormed off, slamming the door behind him. He left empty-handed and defeated, still convinced this was just a phase, that I'd somehow relent. But he was wrong. In the weeks that followed, I heard through mutual acquaintances how he struggled to piece his life back together. His reputation at work was tarnished, his finances strained, and his double life in shambles. Even his precious image, always so important to him, was starting to crack. The mistress he'd clung to as his fresh start had left him too, disgusted by the web of lies he'd woven. For the first time, he was alone. Truly alone. No one to lean on, no one willing to pick up the pieces of his shattered ego. And I, finally free, was watching from afar, rebuilding my own life with a newfound sense of peace. The satisfaction didn't come from watching him suffer, that was just a bonus. The real victory was reclaiming my power, my self-worth, piece by piece. I had taken back everything he tried to steal from me. My confidence, my independence, my voice. I was no longer defined by his betrayal, but by my strength in moving beyond it. And in the end, he became nothing more than a painful lesson, a reminder of the woman I'd become despite him. Author's commentary. This is a pivotal moment where she takes her power back. Serving the divorce papers isn't just a legal move, it's a personal triumph. The reader feels the satisfaction of her victory and wonders how her husband will cope with the fallout. Chapter 8. The Final Betrayal. In the end, it all fell apart faster than I could have imagined. He was used to manipulating people, to using charm and smooth words to keep his life neatly compartmentalized. But when his mistress learned the full truth, she wanted nothing to do with him. All those promises he'd made to her, the future he'd dangled just out of reach, it all crumbled under the weight of his lies. She walked away without a second glance, leaving him to stew in the mess he'd created. I heard through mutual friends that he tried everything to get her back. He sent desperate messages, left voicemails pleading for forgiveness, but she had already moved on, her own anger and hurt eclipsing whatever feelings she'd once had for him. He was left with nothing but a trail of broken promises and a reputation that no amount of charm could repair. For the first time, he was forced to face the wreckage alone. No loyal wife to fall back on, no mistress to flatter his ego, and no colleagues willing to look past the rumors that had quietly followed him back to the office. The world he'd carefully crafted, the lies he'd stacked like a house of cards, had finally come crashing down around him. I can only imagine what went through his mind during those days as he watched everything slip away, powerless to stop it. The life he'd taken for granted, the stability, the love, the loyalty, was gone, replaced by the cold silence of his empty apartment. There was no one left to listen to his excuses, no one left to pretend my own. And in those quiet, precious moments, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: peace. Author's commentary. This chapter brings a sobering realization. Revenge may offer temporary satisfaction, but it cannot heal all wounds. The reader feels her struggle and ponders the cost of vengeance. What will she do next to find peace? Chapter 10. Reclaiming my life. Eventually, I found solace in the things I'd put aside for far too long. I turned to painting, letting colors and textures express the emotions I didn't yet have words for. Each stroke on the canvas felt like a release, a way to empty my heart of all the grief, anger, and hurt that had settled there. I painted for hours, sometimes deep into the night, creating landscapes and abstract pieces that felt like new versions of myself coming to life. In the mornings, I spent time in the garden. I hadn't touched it in years, but I dug my hands into the soil, planted flowers and herbs, and watched them bloom. There was something healing about nurturing life, about seeing seeds take root and grow. I was, in some small way, reclaiming my space, transforming it from a shared past into a symbol of my own resilience. Day by day, I began to rebuild a life that was finally mine. I joined a book club and started volunteering at the community center, meeting people who had no idea about my past. They only knew me as I was in those moments, friendly, a little reserved but kind. I made friends who saw me as I wanted to be seen, not as the wife who had been betrayed, but as a woman with her own dreams, her own voice. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't defined by someone else's choices. Reconnecting with family brought its own kind of healing. I drifted away during those last few years, too absorbed in trying to hold my marriage together to notice how much I'd pulled back. They welcomed me back without question, no judgments, just open arms and the steady presence I hadn't known I needed. In their company, I felt whole again, surrounded by the love that had always been there, waiting patiently for me to come home. I started exploring new interests, too, things I'd never allowed myself to try. I took a pottery class, finding comfort in molding clay with my hands, shaping something fragile yet beautiful. I signed up for a hiking group and fell in love with the sense of freedom that came from standing at the top of a mountain, the wind in my hair, looking out over miles of untamed wilderness. It reminded me that life was vast, full of possibilities I had barely begun to discover. And there were hard days, of course, days when the memories crept back in, when I'd look at an old photograph or find a forgotten keepsake tucked in a drawer. The pain would return, sharp and unexpected, but I'd learned to sit with it, to let it pass like a wave, knowing that it no longer had the power to pull me under. Those memories were part of me, but they were just that, memories, no longer chains holding me back. As the months went by, I began to see myself differently. I was no longer the woman who had been wronged, who had once defined herself by someone else's love and validation. I was strong, resilient, capable of building a life that was richer and more meaningful than the one I'd lost. I realized I didn't need revenge or even closure from him. I had created my own closure through the life I was now living, the happiness I was carving out on my own terms. One evening, as I watched the sun set over my garden, surrounded by the flowers I'd planted, I felt a quiet joy settle in my heart. I was at peace, truly at peace, in a way I hadn't known was possible. My life was my own now, filled with the small, beautiful things I'd once overlooked. And in that peace, I found something even more precious than revenge. I found myself. That woman who'd once given everything for someone else's dreams, who'd let her own heart break in silence, that woman was gone. In her place stood someone who had been through the fire and emerged whole, stronger, and finally free. The life I had now wasn't the one I'd planned, but it was mine. And that, I realized, was more than enough. Author's commentary. This chapter is a turning point, a moment of healing and self-discovery. Her journey resonates with the reader, reminding us that happiness lies in reclaiming ourselves and finding new purpose. Chapter 11. A Life of My Own. Months later, I found myself sitting in my garden, surrounded by the colors I'd planted with my own hands, breathing in the fresh air. There was a calm that filled me, a quiet happiness I hadn't felt in so long that I'd almost forgotten it existed. But this was different. It wasn't the giddy joy of a fleeting moment or the thrill of a perfect day. It was a steady, lasting peace that felt as if it had taken root deep within me. The revenge I'd planned and executed, while satisfying in its own way, was now a distant memory, a chapter I'd turned the page on. What came after was something far better, a life that belonged to me entirely, shaped by my own choices and desires. I realized that the greatest revenge wasn't his suffering. It was the freedom I'd won back, the ability to create a life he could never touch. It's funny how you don't realize what you're missing until it finds you. I started savoring the quiet, everyday moments, the first sip of coffee in the morning, the laughter of friends, a favorite book on a rainy afternoon. These were small things, maybe things I'd once taken for granted, but now they felt like treasures I'd uncovered, little reminders that joy doesn't have to be complicated. I didn't need grand gestures or dramatic changes. I needed the gentle rhythm of a life that made me feel whole. I traveled, something I'd rarely done before, afraid of leaving him alone or making plans that didn't include us both. Now, I took spontaneous weekend trips, wandered through cities I'd never seen, and hiked trails that reminded me of the vastness of the world. Each trip felt like a piece of me coming back, as if I were rediscovering the parts of myself I'd left behind in that old life. One evening, I hosted a dinner with the friends I'd made along the way, people who knew me for who I was now, not who I had been in the shadow of someone else's love. We laughed late into the night, sharing stories and hopes, and I realized I felt truly at home. This was my world, built piece by piece from the rubble of the past, and it was beautiful. I even caught myself thinking of him now and then, not with bitterness, but with a sense of distance, like remembering an old, faded photograph. I'd stopped wondering what he was doing, or whether he regretted his choices. I knew he probably did, but that was his burden to bear, not mine. I had no room left for that kind of pain. My life was too full. Now, when I looked in the mirror, I saw a woman who had been through darkness and come out stronger, who had fought for her own happiness and won. I didn't need validation or someone else's approval. I had reclaimed my sense of self, my voice, and my dreams. I was living a life that was true to me, and it was more than I could have hoped for. Sometimes, as I lay in bed at night, I'd think back to the woman I'd been, the one who had cried herself to sleep, who had felt broken and lost, and I'd send her a silent promise. You made it. You're okay. You're free. Author's commentary. Her journey has been one of quiet strength, resilience, and rediscovery. As she finds fulfillment in her own life, we realize that the truest victory wasn't found in revenge or in tearing down her past, but in the peace she created afterward. In the end, her triumph was in rebuilding herself, crafting a life of joy and meaning. Her happiness, on her terms, was the greatest revenge she could have asked for, and the ultimate liberation. Chapter 12. Moving forward. I don't regret what I did, but I don't dwell on it either. I learned to forgive myself for the anger, the bitterness, the need for revenge that once consumed me. I see it all now as part of the journey, necessary steps that led me here, to this new chapter of my life. Letting go wasn't easy. It took time, and it took courage. But I can look back on those days and feel a sense of calm instead of resentment. I've created a life now that is all mine. Every morning, I wake up in a home that feels like a true reflection of who I am. It's filled with things that make me happy: books, plants, colors I love, and corners of warmth and comfort that I crafted with my own hands. I don't have to answer to anyone, don't have to worry about someone else's expectations. It's a quiet kind of freedom, but it's everything. I'm grateful, too, for the hard lessons. Each one taught me something vital about myself. The heartbreak forced me to examine my own strength, to see just how much I could endure and still come out whole. The betrayal taught me to trust my instincts, to listen to that inner voice that I'd silenced for too long. And, maybe most importantly, the healing showed me how capable I am of finding peace, even after being broken. I've reconnected with dreams I'd left behind. I've gone back to school, exploring a field I'd once been passionate about but had pushed aside. I'm learning again, growing, discovering new things about the world and myself. I've met people who inspire me, who see me as I am today, not as someone shaped by a painful past. And, slowly, I've begun to open my heart to new experiences, new possibilities, maybe even new love someday, if and when it feels right. When I think of him now, it's with a strange sense of distance, like watching a storm that has long since passed. The anger, the hurt, it's faded, softened by time, and by the happiness I've built without him. I no longer need to know if he regrets what he did, or if he's haunted by his choices. His life is his, and mine is beautifully, completely my own. Every tear I cried, every sleepless night, every hard-won moment of clarity, they made me who I am today. Stronger, wiser, and finally free. I feel a quiet pride in knowing that I walked through fire and came out with something invaluable: self-respect, a peace that's unshakable, and a deep, unbreakable love for myself. I don't live in the shadow of that old life anymore. I live in a new light, one I built from the ground up. And in this light, I am whole. For the first time, I'm living for me, fully and unapologetically. And that, more than anything, is the greatest triumph of all. Author's commentary. Her journey has been one of transformation, resilience, and self-rediscovery. In her final reflection, we see a woman who has taken the pain of her past and transformed it into strength. She has let go of the need for revenge, choosing instead to build a life that fulfills her in every way. Her freedom is profound, not because she's free of him, but because she's free of the past. She stands as an inspiration, a reminder that even in the darkest times, we have the power to shape our own lives, to rise above betrayal, and to find peace on our terms. Her story ends not with bitterness, but with a radiant self-love that will carry her forward.